Hello, my friends. It's the Kiva Gersh with Meir Panim, and today is a very, very specific, special, unique, powerful, and intense day in the Jewish calendar. This is Tisha B'Av, as we call it in Hebrew, the ninth day of the Hebrew month of Av, which is the anniversary, the commemoration, the remembrance of some of the greatest tragedies that happened in all of Jewish history. Specifically, both the first temple and the second temple, each one which stood for over 400 years, the central place of worship and connection and spirituality for the Jewish people. For almost 1,000 years collectively, both of these temples were destroyed on this very day. This is the day of their destruction, and as a result, this day, the 9th of Av, became a fast day, a day of mourning, what people call the saddest day in the entire Jewish calendar. Other tragedies, other catastrophic events have happened on this day as well throughout Jewish history. Almost like this day is a magnet for negative events. So on this day we fast, on this day we mourn, on this day we say very special prayers, and we'll explore all of that later on. But I want to give us context for this day. Why are we mourning Jerusalem? What was Jerusalem for the Jewish people? What used to be there? What was the temple? What were these temples that were both destroyed? So we're going to start at the beginning of the story, and then we'll come all the way up to the mourning practices and the rituals of this day, the 9th of Av, to understand how Jews around the world experience this day, observe this day, and why it really is one of the most powerful days in the entire Jewish calendar. So I'm going to use a slideshow that I put together to help us tell this story. Okay, so let us begin with Jerusalem. Okay, here's a classic picture of Jerusalem today. We're all familiar with this picture, the Western Wall, the Kotel, the Old City. It's important to remember that what we call the Old City, that just was what Jerusalem was back thousands of years ago. Jerusalem only expanded beyond its city walls, its old city walls, in the mid-1800s, and expanded greatly and became a very, very large city, many, many times bigger than it ever was throughout its history. But in the beginning, Jerusalem was a small city, small village even, on a hilltop in the center of the Judean hills. And so we have this classic picture of the Western Wall Plaza, the Kotel, as we call it in Hebrew, which means the wall, the Wailing Wall, as it's also called, because it's a place where people come and cry tears of joy and tears of pain and tears of longing. People from all over the world feel comfortable here. The Jewish people open it up to anyone and everyone to come here and to pray and to express themselves. This is the place of the destruction, though. Right here, this picture that we're seeing, this is the place of destruction. And to just give us a little bit more context for this day, the period of mourning actually started 3 weeks ago. This day is the height of mourning, the deepest mourning, the hardest mourning of the entire year. But we've been already in a mourning period for 3 weeks. Starting 3 weeks ago, we observed another fast day, a shorter fast day, less intense. It goes from the morning until the night, where the 9th of Av, we're fasting all day, from night to night, because we know in the Jewish calendar, the Jewish day starts in the night, just like Shabbat starts Friday night and goes until Saturday night. But 3 weeks ago was the 17th day of the month of Tammuz, the Hebrew month of Tammuz. And on that day too is a fast day, because that's the day that the Romans, 2,000 years ago in the time of the Second Temple, broke through the outer city walls of Jerusalem. For the next 3 weeks, they fought hand-to-hand battles against the Jews. And then, on the 9th of Av, they destroyed Jerusalem and destroyed the temple that once stood there. So we've been in a mourning period for 3 weeks already. And again, we'll talk more of those details a little bit later. But it's important to remember that for 3 weeks, the Jewish world has been so intensely focused on Jerusalem and what it means that we don't have a temple anymore. We have Jerusalem again. We're back. Again, like we said, Jerusalem is bigger than it's ever been before. We have it as our capital, right? But we're still missing the final piece. We're still missing the most important piece, which is the temple. And as we see in this picture, you can see the Dome of the Rock. with the golden top, which wasn't actually always gold. That's a whole nother story. But that sits right where the Jewish temple stood twice, as we said, for each time over 400 years. That is the site of the Jewish temple in the ancient Jewish past. So let's tell the story of Jerusalem and the temple and how it got destroyed and what it means that it's destroyed and how Jews mourn over that destruction today. So again, here's just a classic picture of the Western Wall, people coming to pray, the Israeli flag in the middle, a really, really powerful sight and a really, really powerful symbol. This is not the way it always looked. We'll touch on that a little bit later. Only after 1967 did the Western Wall look like this. As you'll see, it used to be much, much smaller. But today, fortunately, it has a lot of space for a lot of people. And sometimes the area that you see in the picture and a whole other huge area behind it gets filled up with tens of thousands of people coming to pray. But let's go to the beginning. The beginning, Jerusalem was like a city village in ancient times, thousands of years ago. It started off as a Canaanite city. And under King David's rule, it was conquered, made into a Jewish city, and became the capital, the first real capital for the Jewish people in the land of Israel. King David moved there from Hebron, and eventually a palace was built there for the king. And this was the center. This was the central place. Now, it was missing one thing, and that was the spiritual center, because we know that the spiritual center, which at the time was the Mishkan, the tabernacle, moved around from place to place. Most of the time, it was in the city of Shiloh, for over 300 years there. And eventually, under King David's rule and reign, it will be moved to Jerusalem, and making Jerusalem not only the political capital of the Jewish people, but also the spiritual capital. So you can see the kind of a drawing of what Jerusalem looked like 3,000 years ago when it first became the capital of the Jewish people. Here's another rendition of that. You can see that there's hills on either side, on all sides except for the north. Right? You have valleys all around the east, south, and west, with hills on the other side of those valleys, giving it natural protection. But in the north, kind of like a plateau kind of land area. And that's why the northern area of Jerusalem from the north is always where enemies attack, because it was the most susceptible to attacks, the least protected naturally. Anyway, you can see in this picture, right? Well, we'll get back to that in a second. I just want to show you just a little bit. This is a modern day picture, but all in the middle here is where the original Jerusalem used to be. Where there were valleys, now there's roads. You can see the roads all around on the left, bottom, and right. And to the top, at the top, to the north, this is facing north, you can see the area of the Temple Mount today, right? You can see the Dome of the Rock. You can see El Aqsa Mosque. That is where the Jewish temple will eventually be built, right? Here's another picture showing the same idea here in the center. It kind of superimposed walls over the modern day area today, just to show you where the original Jerusalem used to be in correlation with the modern old city today. All right, it was south of what is considered the old city today, but again, just to the north, you can see the Dome of the Rock, all of which sits on the Temple Mount, as we call it. All right. But originally, let's actually just for a moment go back to here, okay? Because eventually the temple will be built, right? Not under King David's rule, as you might know from the Bible. He was not allowed to build the temple, but he made all kinds of preparations for the temple. It was his son, King Solomon, who will build the temple, and that will be built to the north on Mount Moriah, which is exactly the location that it was supposed to be built on, that they knew that was the place, right? Mount Moriah is very well known in Jewish history for various reasons. One that correlates to the story of Jacob and the ladder and the angels, okay, coming down between heaven and earth. That is Mount Moriah is connected to that. Mount Moriah is also the place where Abraham brings Isaac for the almost sacrifice. All right, and on a spiritual level, we learn that the foundation stone of the world where the earth began to get created, is located right on Mount Moriah. And that's why the temple was ordered to be built specifically there, because of that historical and spiritual deep connection. Okay, so just moving forward again, just to show you a little bit of the topography. Before the temple was built, it was, open, bare, mountainous region. Okay, and eventually a temple will be built on that. Wasn't the biggest, wasn't the flattest. They did what they could with the resources and the tools they had back then, thousands of years ago, and they built the temple on Mount Moriah where it was meant to be. Okay, but eventually, let's fast forward. That was the first temple. The first temple was built on this kind of, uneasy terrain. But during the second temple, after the second temple got rebuilt by the Jews who returned from the Babylonian exile, eventually, a few hundred years after that, the last king of Israel appointed by the Romans, who were then in charge at the time, King Herod, he was a master builder, a master architect, and he basically said, "You call that a temple? I'll show you a temple." And he wanted to build a much, much bigger space around the temple. Now, he couldn't destroy the temple and rebuild it. That would be not okay. But what he did is he basically created a level space all around it. It was a huge architectural feat, especially for that time, 2,000 years ago. It took many, many years, even decades, but eventually it was finished. And he succeeded, and he built what we call the Temple Mount today. It didn't exist during the first temple time, and it didn't exist for most of the second temple time. Only in his days, right? He died, according to historians, in the year 4 BCE. So we see that the Temple Mount area is expanded under King Herod, making it a much, much larger area to accommodate more and more Jews that come there all the time, but specifically in the 3 pilgrimage festivals, Passover, Shavuot, and Sukkot. Okay, and here we have a model. This actually is a picture of an amazing model that maybe some of you have been to before, in Jerusalem, at the Israel Museum, outside in their outdoor area. And this is a kind of an aerial view of the model of Jerusalem during the Second Temple period, of the Second Temple itself. And you can see in this model, the space around the temple itself, this Temple Mount that King Herod created in such a beautiful way. So much so that the sages who were alive to see it said, if you haven't seen the temple of King Herod, you haven't seen beauty. That's how beautiful he made the temple. That's how much he invested in it. So we see, right, a close-up look. This is the main part of the temple. All right. I mean, this is the temple itself. Right, this building that stands tall is called a sanctuary. We'll take a look at what happened in there. And outside is where they had the altar and the sacrifices, and then all kinds of room for storage and other purposes as well. It's a very intricate type of building with all kinds of, inner chambers and hallways and hidden things. Very, very interestingly built, and interesting to learn about how it was built. Okay, so let's talk about the temple, right? If we're saying that the ninth of Av is all about mourning the destruction of the temple, let's understand, what was the temple for? What was it about? Why is it such a big deal that we don't have one today? The temple, during the first temple time specifically, was not only the main place of worship for the Jewish people, it was the only place of worship. Today, we're used to synagogues being all over the place, especially in large cities, and of course, especially in Israel. In Israel, you can't walk, a few blocks without seeing another synagogue. And in big cities like LA and New York and certain areas, you see tons and tons of synagogues. Well, that did not exist during the first temple times. The first temple time, you only had the temple. That's where people went to, to worship God. And how did people worship God back then? Primarily through sacrifices. Jews were not allowed to offer sacrifices on their own. And the only place sacrifices were allowed to be brought was in the temple. And only by the Kohanim, the priests who worked there. Right? They had all different kind of shifts, different families of priests, and each family took turns working in the temple. Right, so it was a very, very specific place, very specific guidelines and rules. But every single day, sacrifices were brought on behalf of the entire nation. One in the morning, one in the afternoon. All kinds of individual sacrifices were brought by people for all kinds of different reasons. Maybe it was a sin offering, maybe it was a Thanksgiving offering, maybe something else, maybe it was a donation. But offerings were always being brought to the temple. And this was the ancient way. As hard as it is to understand today for us modern day humans. Back then, sacrifice was a spiritual thing. It was a spiritual tool. It was a way to connect to God. And we had this, the Jewish people had this in the temple in a very, very specific way, right? So that it would be kept, within the guidelines of monotheism. Because remember, all around the Jewish people back then, all around the Israelite nation, were polytheistic tribes and cultures, also doing sacrifices, but in a very different way, into many gods. Right? And God, the Torah, Judaism did not want the Israelites to stray after that. So it gave them very specific guidelines on what to do, how to do, when to do, where to do, right? So that they would stay on the monotheistic path. But here we can see the outside of the sanctuary, and you can see this altar, right? You can see the altar over here on the left side. You can see it here better. A very large altar with a huge ramp, and the priest would walk up the ramp and put different parts of different animals on the altar, different times for different sacrifices. There are multiple fires on the altar, burning at all times. And whenever there was a sacrifice brought, the Levites would be playing music. There was like an orchestra playing in the temple anytime there was sacrifices, which means multiple times a day. They were playing music, singing songs, singing the Psalms of King David. And you can see they're all wearing very, very special clothing. This was not normal everyday clothing. The priests had to wear 4 special garments when they served in the temple. The high priest, right, who was the most spiritually powerful person in the entire nation, he wore 8 special garments. So lots of little details, lots of practices, lots of rituals and rules to follow. And so here's a classic scene from the temple, and what they're doing is on behalf of the whole nation. They are worshiping God on behalf of the whole nation. It was a collective, communal form of religious worship, right? Inside the sanctuary, that building that we saw before, okay? This is what it looks like on the inside. High ceilings, very decorative, very ornate. And they had a few things in here, right? When you enter in, the first thing you get to is a small, tiny little altar where they put incense on every single day. They put incense on there for beautiful, beautiful fragrance, but also for spiritual reasons. To the right was the table with the special breads, the show bread as they're called. And these were specially baked breads by a certain family of priests. They baked them fresh once a week. They put them on these golden tables and they stayed fresh the whole week. And they were eaten on Shabbat by the priests. That was the miracle, one of the many miracles of the temple. And across from there, we see the menorah, of course. They only needed one menorah. King Solomon put in more, but the menorah was lit every single day. 3 candles on each side, 1 in the middle. And though it gave physical light, it was more about giving the spiritual light of the temple out into the world, right? Because we learned that the temple was meant to be a house of prayer for all the nations. And in the back, behind this huge curtain, that's the Holy of the Holies. The Holy of the Holies has inside of it, okay, the Ark of the Covenant. The Ark of the Covenant, right, has inside of it the 10 Commandments, the ones that Moses brought down from Mount Sinai. And nobody was allowed in this room. That's the Holy of the Holies. It's called Kodesh HaKodeshim. It's the holiest place on earth, according to Judaism, that sits right on that foundation stone that we mentioned before, right? From which the world, the earth, was first created. Very, very special place physically and spiritually. And only one day of the year is one person allowed to go in there. And that's at Yom Kippur, right? Another fast day, but not a fast day of mourning, a fast day of spiritual cleansing. And the high priest goes in there multiple times throughout the day to do all kinds of rituals. And that's the only time, and he's the only person that ever goes in there all year. The rest of the year, nobody goes in, and it remains empty. Really powerful thing, right? The Holy of the Holies, the most powerful and holy place on earth, according to Judaism, the Jewish tradition, right? And we have the menorah, just to focus on that a little bit. We know the whole story of Hanukkah revolves around the menorah and the times of the Greek, the Greek rule of the land of Israel. Right? They passed many anti-Semitic measures, and the Jews revolted. And the Greeks had taken over Jerusalem, and they contaminated the temple spiritually. They made it impure by bringing unkosher animals and sacrificing them on the altar, doing all kinds of other things, idols bringing inside. So when the Jews came in, led by the Maccabees, and they took over Jerusalem again, they retook took the temple, they had to purify everything, right? We know the story that they only found one small jar of pure olive oil that would last only one day, but the miracle is that it lasted 8 days. Right? And that's how long it took to get new, fresh, pure, kosher olive oil for the menorah, and that's why we celebrate 8 days of Hanukkah. Okay, I want to zoom out a little bit and look at Jerusalem itself in the Second Temple time, right? Because to the right of this model that I mentioned before, that you can see at the Israel Museum in Jerusalem, you can see the temple and how it just stands over the whole city. Its size in comparison to the whole city, it's massive. And this was classic Roman building back then. This was how Herod learned to build and loved to build. Massive building projects. He built many things around the land of Israel. Some of them are still partially visible to see, including the Temple Mount. And they're all massive. They're all on this grand scale. Very much, again, in the Roman style. And you can see different neighborhoods, right down below to the south. All these white buildings below the Temple Mount are for the average people, right? The area with the red rooftops, that's for the richer, more wealthy Jews and also Romans who lived in the city, right? Their buildings and homes being built very much in the Roman style, being very much influenced by the Roman culture. The other people living in other parts of the city, much less influence, if influenced at all. Many of them were actually against Roman culture, right? There was a lot of tension, which we'll get to very soon. So moving on, right, we see these massive stairways going up to the temple because it needed to accommodate a massive amount of people, right? Tons and tons of Jews would come here for the pilgrimage festival. They would all come from all different directions to Jerusalem, need a place to stay, a place to eat. They brought sacrifices. They wanted to come to the Temple Mount. They wanted to get close. They wanted to have a spiritual experience. And that's why the Temple Mount is so massive, so big, right? And we can see really well in this picture that when King Herod changed the topography of the area around the temple, he made it unstable. And therefore, he built 4 walls all around to stabilize and also to fill in with more earth to make this huge flat area called the Temple Mount. And these 4 walls that he built are retaining walls. They hold up the mountain from collapsing. To the south, to the east, to the north, and also to the west. And this is what the Western Wall is. A lot of people don't realize or know that the Western Wall, which would be in this part over here where you can hopefully see my cursor, the Western Wall was a retaining wall. It was not anything special. It wasn't holy. It wasn't spiritual. It wasn't religious back then. Nobody went there to pray, right? They went up to the Temple Mount and brought sacrifices as part of their worship. If they prayed a personal prayer, it was up there, not down below. Down below, there was all kinds of stalls and stores to buy things that they needed to bring up to the temple, including animals for sacrifice. Only after the temple gets destroyed 2,000 years ago does this area become special because of 2 reasons. One, because it becomes one of the few areas of the original walls that is the most intact. 2, actually 3 reasons. 2, it's the closest to where the temple used to be. Okay, the closest to where it used to be. And 3, eventually over time, not right away, but over time, the other parts of the wall were covered up by either earth, dirt, or buildings. And this was one of the only places, if not the only place in the entire length of the Western Wall that was exposed and accessible to people, specifically Jews, to come and pray. Okay, just to know how kind of parallels superimposes where the Dome of the Rock is today, right? That's, like I said before, is where the temple used to stand. And you can kind of just superimpose the Temple Mount 2,000 years ago right onto the Temple Mount today and see where things line up and how things line up. Again, where the Dome of the Rock is today, which was built at the end of the 600s, about 1,400 years ago, that's where the temple stood hundreds of years before. Okay, and was built there about 1,000 years before, at least the second temple. All right. Okay, now we understand Jerusalem, we understand the temple, we understand the significance of the temple. Let's just add a couple more things. That the temple was like the connector between heaven and earth for the Jewish people. It was the spiritual center. It was where they believed all the prayers went to before going up to heaven, and where all the blessings came to from heaven, before spreading out around the whole world. It was the connector. It was the connecting place, the most powerful, holy, and spiritual place in all of the world. And then a war breaks out. The Romans start to rule the land of Israel in the year 63 BCE. There was a political conflict at the time. The Romans took advantage of that weakness in the nation. They came in, they conquered, they took over. From 63 CE, for hundreds of years later, they ruled the land of Israel. All right. In fact, that year was the last time the Jews ruled their own country in the land of Israel before 1948, when the state of Israel was born. Think about that. The Romans come in, and eventually they're very, very harsh in their policy and in their laws. They do a lot of things. They pass a lot of policies that are very economically and religiously discriminatory against the Jews, making it hard for Jews to be Jews in their own homeland. Right? Again, both economically and religiously. The seat of power for the Romans was in Caesarea, right on the shores of the Mediterranean Sea, about 45 minutes north of modern-day Tel Aviv, although back then Tel Aviv did not exist. Okay, Tel Aviv is a modern city. And this is an aerial view of the national park, the archaeological park in Caesarea today. The Romans built a Roman city there, right on the shores. They built an amphitheater. They built a racetrack, a place for gladiator fights, a place for theater. Right here on the right side, this kind of stretch of land reaching out into the ocean was built by King Herod for his palace in Caesarea. He had a swimming pool inside the palace that was fed by the waters of the Mediterranean Sea. And this was the seat of power. It was also a place of great tension between the Romans who lived there and the Jews who lived in Caesarea. And things were getting more and more tense throughout the country, but specifically in Caesarea. And in 66 CE, things crossed the line, let's say, the tensions in Caesarea. And the Jews there had no more patience. And from here is where a revolt broke out. And from here it spread to Jerusalem and eventually to the entire country. And it was a Jewish revolt against the Romans, trying to get the Romans out of the land of Israel. It was a Jewish attempt to regain independence and regain Jewish rule over the Jewish homeland. This revolt, called the Great Revolt, lasted from 66 to 70. And in the beginning, the Jews were doing very well. They were defeating the Romans in all kinds of areas, taking over Roman strongholds. But eventually the tides turned, and the Romans took back all the places that they had lost and then some. And as the years went on, they eventually got to Jerusalem in the year 70, and they laid siege to the city by surrounding the city with Roman soldiers. This was a very, very gruesome revolt. In the end, about 500,000 Jews died in this revolt, fighting against the Romans. At the time, we can look at it as this generation's Holocaust. It's a horrible, horrible tragedy. And that tragedy only got added onto in the year 70 CE, when the Romans broke through and crossed over the walls of Jerusalem, like we mentioned before, on the 17th day of the Hebrew month of Tammuz. For the next 3 weeks, fighting hand-to-hand combat with Jews in the streets who were already starving because they had barely any food. And the Romans had surrounded the city, trying to starve the Jews either to death or into submission, which they didn't do either of. They stayed there. Many of them died of hunger, of starvation. And when the Romans came in, they put up the best fight they could. It lasted for 3 weeks. Right? And then on the 9th day of the Hebrew month of Av, as we said before, the Romans reached the temple. They took over the temple. They destroyed the temple. Right? And these are illustrations of the Romans inside the temple. Right? The big, huge altar that we saw before, fighting the Jews inside the temple area. Right? And eventually setting fire and setting destruction to the temple, the holiest place on earth for the Jewish people, the place of worship to God, the central place of worship. And as we know, the Romans took with them all kinds of vessels from the temple itself. Here you can see in the picture them taking the golden menorah. In the back, you can see them taking the golden tables that we mentioned before, where they put the bread. So they're laying destruction, and they're taking the items of value, both monetarily and religiously. And this is 70 CE, and the temple is destroyed in front of the eyes of the surviving Jews from this great revolt that lasted for 4 years. This is a major low in Jewish history, a major tragedy. The temple destroyed. It was destroyed once before, hundreds of years before, eventually to be rebuilt. The Jews in this generation had no idea if and when it would ever get rebuilt. We know 2,000 years later, it still hasn't gotten rebuilt. Though there is a belief in a third temple. We'll talk about that shortly. Okay. And we know that the Romans, when they went back to Rome, they built a victory arch, the Arch of Titus, right? Titus was the general who led the fight against the Jews in Jerusalem. And they built this arch, which still stands today. You can see it today as a monument of the victory of the Romans over the Jews, right? And inside you can see they carved a picture of Jews carrying, Jewish slaves walking through the streets of Rome, carrying their own holy menorah themselves. Okay. This is the Arch of Titus. This is a spitting in the face of the Jews. We defeated you. You're gone. At the same time, they minted coins called Judea Capta. Judea Capta was written on it, which means Judea is captured. They thought the Jews were done. They thought that they were finally the ones, the conquerors, who were going to end Jewish history. Right? Ironically and amazingly enough, in Jerusalem, during the years of the modern state of Israel, archaeologists digging in the area of Jerusalem found coins that said Judea Capta, minted by the Romans themselves. How amazing to find those. And to know that the ancient Romans are no longer here, yet the Jews have survived this entire time. Came back, rebuilt their country, their independence, rebuilt Jerusalem to an extent, and found these coins, right, in the earth of Jerusalem. So, with this idea in mind, the menorah, you can see this in the Old City in Jerusalem today. This is a menorah made out of gold that is made to the standards of the Torah, to the instructions and requirements and dimensions of the Torah. They say that this could be used in a future third temple when it comes. So a beautiful thing to see, and really like a symbol of memory, of remembrance, and of Jewish strength and pride and perseverance, not giving up, no matter how long it takes. Okay, let's pause here because for now, okay, I just want to stop sharing and share a bit about Meir Panim, right? Because this is the 9th of Av. This is a tough day. Many Jews are fasting. They're hungry. And the truth is, there are a lot of hungry people in Israel every day. And they don't know oftentimes where their next meal is going to come from. They don't have enough money to fill their fridges and their kitchens with food. And that's where Meir Panim comes in. Meir Panim, for many, many years, is an organization that is literally changing lives of so many thousands upon thousands of Israelis with different branches all over the country, serving the most underprivileged in Israel. Those living below the poverty lines, single mothers with kids, Holocaust survivors who are living on next to nothing. In addition to that, they're helping soldiers of all kinds, especially lone soldiers, who have moved to Israel from countries all around the world to serve in the IDF, to defend the Jewish state, without family here in Israel to go back to when they have a free weekend. Right? They can't bring their laundry home to be done. They can't go home and get a home-cooked meal. They're on their own. And Meir Panim reaches out to them and helps them tremendously with programs and with food and with meals. Right? And in addition to this, since October 7th and this war against terrorism, right, and the hundreds of thousands of evacuated citizens from the south along the border with Gaza and the north along the border with Lebanon, Meir Panim has showed up and helped out thousands and thousands of evacuated families, helping them get by with food and with services and with programs and supplies. So Meir Panim for years has been doing so much, and this year they're doing even more. And that's why we ask you to open up your heart and give what you can. You can click on the link below and you could get to the page of making a donation, and knowing that your donations are not only helping Meir Panim, they're the only way that Meir Panim can continue to do the amazing essential work that they're doing here in Israel, serving all of these different kinds of very, very needy populations in the country, especially this year, with this very long war now going into over 10 months, helping soldiers on the front lines, helping evacuated families still out of their homes 10 months later after this war has begun. So please, again, you can click on the link below to help Meir Panim do all their incredible work that they do in this country. I've visited many of their centers around the country, and I know that it's not only food that they give to people, they're giving hope. They're giving a smile. Many times people come in for a meal, it's the only people they talk to all day. And the staff of Meir Panim, the volunteers, they're smiling at them. They know their names. Shlomo, how are you? Sarah, how's it going? It's the only human contact these people have sometimes any day, every day. So Meir Panim is filling them up in many ways with food and other ways as well. So please, again, you can click on the link down below. Please give what you can, knowing that all of your money is really literally going to save so many people in Israel, all right, from hitting rock bottom. Meir Panim is there to make sure they don't and to lift them up. Thank you so much. Let's continue our program, all right, into the last part of our program, okay? And that is this day, the 9th of Av, right? Let me just first get this back up here, right? Well, again, we come back to this picture of the Temple Mount, an aerial view. We're down below. You can see the plaza of the Western Wall where people come to pray. You can see the Temple Mount itself with the Al-Aqsa Mosque, the Dome of the Rock. All right, but it's on this day, okay, that hearts all around the world, Jewish hearts, and also our friends in other communities, their hearts are focused on this place, Jerusalem, mourning over its destruction, right? Praying for its rebuilding, thinking about what it once was, and thinking about what we lost, okay? I want to share with you some of the rituals that people take on and practice during this day, the 9th of Av. And let's keep the picture of Jerusalem on the screen. I think it'll be really helpful. First of all, we said this mourning period started 3 weeks ago. So already 3 weeks ago, the practices of mourning began, right? With first, no celebrations, no weddings, no live music, no haircuts, no buying new clothes, right? Trying to reduce the joy and celebration in our lives so that we can focus more on Jerusalem and its destruction 2,000 years ago. And then 9 days ago, on the first day of the Hebrew month of Av, we enter a period called the 9 days, where in addition to all the restrictions I just mentioned, Jews around the world don't go swimming. They don't drink wine. They don't eat meat during the week. On Shabbat they can. But also to restrict, to limit their joy, their celebration, to focus even more so as we get closer and closer to this day, the 9th of Av, our thoughts and our minds, our prayers on Jerusalem and its destruction, and what it means that we don't have Jerusalem anymore. And we said before that Jerusalem was the spiritual center it still is the spiritual center of the universe for the Jewish people, but the temple was a place where you can feel that, where you can express that, where you can connect to that. And it's gone, and it's been gone for 2,000 years. And while it might be really hard to understand what it really means to lack something that you've never seen, lack something that you've never been in, that you've never experienced, right? Still, we pass on from generation to generation in the Jewish people this idea that we lost something of the greatest magnitude possible, that we can't even imagine. But every year during these 3 weeks, and on the 9th of Av specifically, we're trying to imagine, we're trying to remember what it meant to have a temple in Jerusalem, so that we can really understand what it means that we don't anymore. Okay? On the 9th of Av itself, we don't eat. From the nighttime until the nighttime after. A full day comes out to about almost 25 hours. We don't eat, we don't drink. Okay? We don't wear leather, right? Taking pleasure away for those who wear leather. All right? Back in the day, they used to put nice smelling oils on their body. We don't do that. No anointing with oil. Okay. Some people even have a custom of sleeping on the floor, so their sleep is a little bit less comfortable. At nighttime and also the first half of the day, we don't sit on normal chairs. We sit low to the ground. Some people sitting right on the ground. Some people wear no shoes, they go barefoot. Right? All kinds of things that we do to remind us that this is a different day. Every morning of the year, Jewish men put on talit and tefillin in their morning prayers. On this day, we don't. We do it in the afternoon, but not in the morning to show us again, this is a different day. Right? We're in mourning. We're in serious mourning over the loss of Jerusalem 2,000 years ago, the destruction of the temple. In addition to everything I said already, we say special prayers called kinot, both at night and in the morning. And we recite specifically at night. Some people repeat it during the day. The book of Lamentations, written by the prophet Jeremiah, right? During the actual destruction of the first temple. He was put into a pit, into a prison cell underneath the ground, and he heard the destruction of the first temple while he was in there. And it's he who wrote the words of the book of Lamentations, the book of Eicha, as we call it in Hebrew. Eicha, just crying out to God. Eicha, lamenting to God over the destruction that was experienced and what was lost. And this is what happens in the ninth of Av in terms of the mourning, right? In terms of really weeping and crying over the loss of Jerusalem, and understanding its impact and its significance. All right. So with all that in mind, I kind of want to wrap up and share that there is a glimmer of hope in the ninth of Av. Right? As intense as it is, as sad as it is, there's actually a very hopeful aspect of the ninth of Av. In the book of Lamentations, the ninth of Av is called a moed, a holiday. How can you understand that? According to Jewish tradition, the Messiah is born on the ninth of Av. The Messiah representing the future redemption for all of humanity. How is that possible? It's possible because it's so Jewish. On the lowest day of the year, so to speak, the saddest day of the year, so to speak, out of that comes our greatest hope. Because we're not in a place of sadness that brings us to losing hope. It's a sadness of a kind, more of a broken heart, mourning over the loss. But on some level, and this is asked by great sages of the Jewish people, what's the point of mourning over something that's no longer here? And so they answer, that's not the point, actually. That's not the deepest point of the ninth of Av. The deepest point is to feel the pain of the fact that we still don't have a rebuilt Jerusalem. To feel the pain that there's still brokenness in the world, still pain and suffering. We're not necessarily mourning what was, but what is now, still. That's what we're really mourning. And from that mourning, we hope to be motivated to doing all we can, what we can, to make this world a better place, to fix this world, which is such a basic Jewish idea. And that's why it totally makes sense that it's called a holiday. That's why it totally makes sense that, according to Jewish tradition, the Messiah is born on the ninth of Av. Because out of the ashes of destruction come the hope for redemption, the belief in a better future. And this is really the essence of the ninth of Av. Right? And that's why it says that also in the Hebrew Bible that the ninth of Av and other fast days will turn into days of joy and celebration in the future. Completely change. And we see it soon in our days. Let's just finish off by saying in 1967, something great happened. The Jewish people came into Jerusalem during the Six-Day War, unplanned, right? But the Jordanians attacked us. We warned them not to. They didn't listen. They did, and we attacked back. And as a result, the leadership of the military and the government literally drew battle plans for the old city while it was happening. Right? They came into the city, and hours later, they were standing at the Western Wall. You can see how thin the area before the Western Wall used to be. I told you that before, right? Here are soldiers gathering there with the chief rabbi of the IDF at the time, Rabbi Shlomo Goren, holding a small Torah scroll, celebrating in the middle of the battle, in the middle of the war, celebrating the fact that the Jews have returned to the Western Wall. They've returned to Jerusalem. And Jerusalem once again is in the hands of the Jewish people for the first time in 2,000 years. This was 1967, a cause of unbelievable celebration. It was a tough battle. It was a hard battle. Many soldiers died. And these soldiers who thankfully survived are sitting down at the end of the battle, getting a well-deserved rest against the stones of the Western Wall. Right? And this is what it looks like in the days right afterwards. They right away, the Israeli government cleared out the area, knowing that this is our holiest place. At least it's next to our holiest place. The holiest place is the Temple Mount. We want to give access to all the Jews in all the world to the Western Wall, make it way bigger than it used to be, like we see here, and make ample space for people to come and pray properly. And this is what it looks like just days later, right? There's still trees planted there, right? But they clear out the area, they make a space for Jews to come and to pray. Right? Again, this is just days after the 6-day war, after the redemption of Jerusalem and the reunification of Jerusalem for the Jewish people. And this is that same rabbi blowing a shofar, which is a symbol of redemption, of freedom, of something great just happened. It's an amazing, amazing moment. And this very famous picture of the 3 soldiers from the paratroopers who were part of the group of soldiers that liberated Jerusalem and came to the Western Wall on that day, in that moment. All right. So this is all Jerusalem. This is the story of Jerusalem and how it connects to the Jewish people. And though, like I said before, we have come back to Jerusalem, Jerusalem is not yet fully rebuilt without the temple being there. And it reminds us of the words of Jeremiah in chapter 56, verse 7, when he says, I will bring them to my holy mount, God says, and I will cause them to rejoice in my house of prayer. Their burnt offerings and their sacrifices shall be acceptable upon my altar. For my house shall be called a house of prayer for all peoples, like we mentioned before. And it's amazing because the Rabbi Shlomo Goren, who we looked at before, when he got there, he had his Torah scroll, he blew the shofar, and he also made an announcement that got broadcast over the radio, saying to the people of all religions, of all nations, you are welcome here. We invite you to come here and pray. Right? Fulfilling this verse from Jeremiah. Unbelievable. An incredible thing. And I want to end with this, that Jerusalem is really the story of the Jewish people. It was our first capital. It's our everlasting capital. We were exiled from it. We came back. Right? There was a first temple. There was a second temple. We believe one day there will be a third temple, right? In the Messianic times. But even before that, we feel the coming of those times, the coming of those days, because prophecies have been coming true left and right in Jerusalem and all over the land of Israel. And when I see this picture, I think exactly of this prophecy from Zechariah. When he wrote, there shall be yet old men and old women dwell in the streets of Jerusalem, and the streets of the city shall be full of boys and girls playing in the streets thereof. This, my friends, might look like a simple picture of girls playing jump rope, skipping over a rope, but this is actually a fulfillment of an ancient prophecy thousands of years old. And this is the story of Jerusalem. This is the story that we try to remember all the time, but specifically on this day, the 9th of Av, specifically on this day, the 9th of Av, the anniversary of the destruction of Jerusalem 2,000 years ago, and the second temple time, many hundreds of years before that in the first temple time. So we're both remembering what was and hoping for and praying for what could be. But along the way, we're seeing signs, we're seeing miracles, and that's encouraging and very hopeful. So I want to thank you all, my friends, for joining me, for listening, for partaking, for participating, for being here. And I want to give you one more chance to click on the link below and really open up your hearts and give what you can to Meir Panim, who again is literally saving lives and changing the lives of soldiers and families, Holocaust survivors, impoverished citizens of Israel, and evacuated families here in Israel. All different kinds of very, very needy populations. Meir Panim has been helping for years and years and years, and especially during this war that is now already over 10 months long. So please click on the link, give what you can to Meir Panim, knowing that your donation is going directly to them to help them make a huge difference in Israel, right? The one Jewish state in the entire world. So I want to thank you again so much for being here. My blessing to my honor to share with you, and my blessing to you is that you should be well and you should be safe. You should always keep Jerusalem in your heart. And and always be connected to this incredible story. Again, the link is there. You know where you can give, and if you can bless Israel, believe me, Israel will bless you back. So thank you so much, everyone. All the best, and be well.